Our reading comes from Genesis chapter 47, verse 28 onwards. Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years, and the years of his life were 147. When the time drew near for Israel to die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, "If I have found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh and promise that you will show me kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt, but when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried." "I will do as you say," he said. "Swear to me," he said. Then Joseph swore to him, and Israel worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. Some time later, Joseph was told, "Your father is ill." So he took his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, along with him. When Jacob was told, "Your son Joseph has come to you," Israel rallied his strength and sat up in bed. Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and there he blessed me and said to me, 'I am going to make you fruitful and increase your numbers. I will make you a community of peoples, and I will give you this land as an everlasting possession to your descendants after you.' Now then, your 2 sons born to you in Egypt before I came to you here will be reckoned as mine. Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are mine. Any children born to you after them will be yours. In the territory they will inherit, they will be reckoned under the names of their brothers. As I was returning from Paddan, to my sorrow, Rachel died in the land of Canaan while we were still on the way, a little distance from Ephrath. So I buried her there beside the road to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem." When Israel saw the sons of Joseph, he asked, Who are these?" "They are the sons God has given me," Joseph said to his father. Then Israel said, "Bring them to me so that I may bless them." Now Israel's eyes were failing because of his old age, and he could hardly see. So Joseph brought his sons close to him, and his father kissed them and embraced them. Israel said to Joseph, "I never expected to see your face again, and now God has allowed me to see your children too."
Then Joseph removed them from Israel's knees and bowed down with his face to the ground. And Joseph took both of them, Ephraim on his right toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh on his left towards Israel's right hand, and brought them close to him. But Israel reached out his right hand and put it on Ephraim's head, though he was the younger. And crossing his arms, he put his left hand on Manasseh's head, even though Manasseh was the firstborn. Then he blessed Joseph and said, "May the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked faithfully, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys. May they be called by my name and the names of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and may they increase greatly on the earth." When Joseph saw his father placing his right hand on Ephraim's head, he was displeased. So he took hold of his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. Joseph said to him, "No, my father, this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He too will become a people, and he too will become great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a group of nations." He blessed them that day and said, "In your name will Israel pronounce this blessing. May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh." So he put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, "I am about to die, but God will be with you and take you back to the land of your fathers. And to you I give one more ridge of land than to your brothers, the ridge I took from the Amorites with my sword and my bow." May God be pleased to bless the reading and the preaching of his word.
I want to take you back to March of 2020. It's 8 p.m, I think it's on a Thursday evening, and the current Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, delivers the now infamous words, "From this evening, I give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home." And from that moment, the rhythms of normality shattered. Normal life disappeared overnight. Work stopped for many. Homes began to feel like cages. Furloughs became a word that we learned all too fast. Supermarket shelves were stripped bare. Drug dealers began to sell toilet rolls instead. And somehow Zoom quizzes even began to be a thing. Sure, we laughed a little, but underneath the humor, there was something that sat heavy on the chest. It wasn't just a season that was inconvenient. It was actually deeply painful. Some of us, like Abby and myself, had to introduce our family to Rafa through glass windows. And at the other end of life, sons and daughters had to say goodbye to parents through FaceTime. Funerals began to be reduced in number, 10, 15, spaced out. No hugs, no hands, no shared tears. Grief, but without the gentle touch. And then something else began to happen. Every day, the news began to read out a number. The daily death count. And day after day, that number kept climbing. And people again and again would say, I cannot take this. And they were not talking about the restrictions or the boredom or even the Zoom quizzes, but the death. That daily constant reminder that life is fragile, that tomorrow is not promised. And yet here's the reality, it's not just in the middle of a pandemic with the number flashing across our screen that we often shy away from thinking about death. We avoid it as much as possible. And yet here's the inescapable truth. If Christ does not come in our lifetime, something will seal our fate. It is coming for you. And you do not know when. Many of us have the idealized picture of dying, maybe at home or in a place that we know, surrounded by our nearest and dearest, slipping off peacefully in the night, or if you're Chris, it's in the back hall with a fig roll. But you and I know it's not always that reality. Not every one of us will make it to 90. Something will get us, whether it is a car crash, a quiet hospice, a sudden stroke, or something. It will seal our fate. And the writer of Hebrews does not stutter when he says to us, it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment. Now, when we read that verse, a lot of the times we immediately go to the judgment. Are we right with God? And absolutely, that is important and we must consider. But this evening, I want us to think more about the preparing for death itself. Because notice as we turn to Genesis 47 and 48 and also into verse 49, it's like the narrative of the story of Joseph slows down. The noise fades, the famine zooms out somewhere else, and the camera begins to focus in. And the question is being laid bare, are you prepared to die? To see the scene, the famine is raging across the world, and in the middle of it all, the camera zooms in on an elderly man. Jacob, the patriarch, who is in the final chapters of his life. His strength is fading, his body is wearing out, but his eyes are clear with faith. He knows the end is coming, but notice with me, he's not panicking, is he? But preparing. And how does he prepare to die? Not by clinging to the security that Egypt offers, but by anchoring himself in the promises of God. For here is a man who gathers his families together, who blesses his sons, not just with sentimental words, but with prophetic truth, and ensures that his bones will be carried to the land of promise, declaring to his people with his last breath, Egypt was never truly his home. So see it, brothers and sisters, here is a man who's teaching us tonight what it looks like to die well. And so I want us to look at these passages, and in many ways there's so much we can consider in these verses, but I just want us to hone in tonight on Jacob and to think about how his preparation for the end of his days can help us as we prepare for the end of our days. So 3 points tonight. Firstly, notice with me, when life is fading, God is providing. As we've seen at this point now in the storyline of Joseph and the book of Genesis, Joseph's family have now completed their journey from the land of Canaan to settle in Egypt. The famine is still going on. It's still raging through the land, but because of Joseph's foresight, during the 7 years of plenty, they have stored up much grain for this very moment. And we've seen in recent weeks that the Egyptians first came to Joseph and they used their money to buy grain. When the money has run out, they trade livestock. When the livestock is gone, they trade their land. So by this point in the storyline of Genesis, the text is making it clear everything now belongs to Pharaoh. And the Egyptians must come to him for survival. But notice with me at this point, the story does not end on despair or scarcity. Verse 27 of Genesis 47 speaks of prosperity after pilgrimage. Genesis 47, verse 27, now the Israelites settled in Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired property there, and they were fruitful and increased greatly in number. And brothers and sisters, at that point, your Genesis antennas should be well up. Because notice that language about being fruitful and increasing in number is not just a casual observance. It is an echo that is deliberately being made to the promises and the words that God said back to Adam in Genesis 1:28, and then to Noah in a recommissioned, cleansed world in Genesis 9:11. That Jacob here and his descendants are part of the continuation of a creational mandate. It is being partly fulfilled, and it will continue to be fulfilled. But notice in those verses, we're seeing more than just multiplication. We are seeing the providence of God at work. Because years back in Genesis chapter 15, he had foretold and promised to Abraham that his descendants will go off to another foreign land. They will live there for 400 years, and then they would come out as a great nation. So even here now in a foreign land under a foreign king, God is ensuring his covenantal people are preserved, protected, and positioned for his plans to come to pass. So here they settle in the land, they begin to prosper, and then in verse 28, the narrative shifts from the descendants to Israel himself. A man who has lived now, the text says, for 17 years in Egypt, and at the age of 147, he knows that his time is coming to a close. Genesis 47, verse 28, Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years, and the years of his life were 147. When the time drew near for Israel to die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, if I have found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh and promise that you will show me kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt, but when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried. Jacob then knows that his days are numbered, so he gathers his son Joseph and he lays before Joseph his funeral wishes. He makes a passionate plea, do not bury me here in Egypt. Take me to the tomb, the family tomb that Abraham had brought for Sarah, the tomb in the land of promise that God had promised to Abraham. Notice this is Jacob saying with his last breath, his hope, his trust, his identity are anchored in the promises of God and not in the security or the comfort of the land of Egypt. And don't miss the pattern. What Jacob does, Joseph then does. Because at the end of Joseph's life, he too makes the Israelites swear an oath not to bury and leave his bones in the land of Egypt forever. But when that day of deliverance does come, that Abraham foretold when was promised all those years ago, take my bones out to once again declare this land, this world, is not my ultimate home, that God's promises, they're bigger than my circumstances, and true inheritance is found in Yahweh alone. So notice what we see in these verses. Here are two men coming towards the end of their lives, making their funeral wishes known. And for those of you who are church members, you will know we have taken that principle from the scriptures and sought to apply it locally. One of the things we ask every church member to do is to do something similar to what Jacob did, to think about your funeral wishes. And on one level, it is practical. It helps serve your family and your church and ensures that your wishes are acknowledged. But more than that, at a deeper level, it says something else. It says that this world is not my home. So that the songs that you pick, the scriptures you want read, the way the service is arranged becomes a testimony beyond the grave to your friends and family that my life was not anchored in the comfort or security of this world, but in the promises of God, my King. So church members, if you haven't filled in that form, let me encourage you to do so. Jacob here is showing us what it looks like to die well, anchoring ourselves in the promises of God rather than the things of this world. But notice not only does he do that, secondly, we see that when days grow short, leave more than memories. By this point, after making the pilgrimage to the land of promise, the passage tells us that Jacob has lived 17 years of his life now in the land of Egypt. For 17 years, he has been immersed in Egyptian culture. A culture that we know had much of its focus on the afterlife. For after all, the Egyptians were deeply religious. They worshipped a host of gods and goddesses, from the god of the sun to the god of the livestock. And that religious obsession was particularly pronounced at death. For the ultimate goal of the Egyptians was to go and join the gods in the afterlife. So much of Egyptian life was actually preparing for death. And now here is Jacob right in the middle of this world, consumed with trying to secure the afterlife. But notice the contrast with me. Jacob is doing something radically different. Here is a man not hoarding wealth, not trying to obtain status or comfort in the afterlife, but he's going after something in a sense better. He's leaving behind a blessing for his family, of showing them the promises of God for the generations that will come after him. For notice, as we transition out of chapter 47 into 48, we see that sometime later, Jacob tells Joseph that he's ill. And Joseph brings along his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And in the first 17 verses of Genesis 47, Jacob reminds Joseph of the promises of God, how God has said things and they have come now to pass. So particularly in verses 3 through to 7, he's reminding Joseph that God has been faithful to his words. He has preserved him. He's brought him out of the land of Canaan and now into the land of Egypt. Here is a man at the end of his life reminding his son that all the way through his days, he has seen and he has experienced the goodness of God. And then notice in verse 8 onwards, he begins to turn his attention not from the past now to the future, as he blesses his grandchildren in Ephraim and Manasseh, verse 15. Then he blessed Joseph and said, May the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked faithfully, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys. May they be called by my name and the names of my father Abraham and Isaac, and may they increase greatly on the earth. Notice what is happening in this moment as Jacob the patriarch stands worshipping the Lord. Hebrews tells us he leans on his staff and he bears witness to the faith of God. And in such a moment, he's less concerned about the future that is unknown for him, but he's more concerned about what will come of the generations after him. Here he is blessing those who will outlive him. He's leaving more than memories. And friends, I want us to consider just for a moment, how can we leave a lasting legacy when our days come to an end? A legacy that blesses not only our immediate family, but also our church family. And let me give you two particular ways we can do that. We can do that, first of all, through leaving spiritual wealth. I've had the great privilege of standing up at many funerals with families. And some of those funerals have been for men and women who come from a great line of Christian faith. That kind of faith that didn't start with them, but in a sense was handed down through generations by the grace of God. And in those moments, you hear children and you hear grandchildren get up and they testify. They tell stories of a spiritual legacy that they've seen in their father or their mother or their grandparents. Something that they could not erase. But we also know it's not always like that, is it? It doesn't always work out that way. Christianity is not hereditary. You cannot pass it down like a family heirloom. You cannot, as much as we want, pray our kids into the kingdom. We cannot will them in there. Every person must meet Jesus for themselves. And yet I've also stood at funerals of believers who have had family who weren't Christians. And yet even in that moment, though they themselves do not know Jesus, and though they themselves are not walking by faith, they have also been able to testify of a godly life that their parent or grandparent lived, about the faith that they witnessed. And though they might not share it, they cannot deny it. And friends, that's the point. We cannot make our children or our grandchildren or our spouses believers. That is not our job. It is the Lord's job. But here's what we can do. We can do three things. Number one, we can put good gospel kindling around them. We can make it that our homes are saturated with the things of God, so the gospel is breathed in, even in that sense, before it's breathed out. Secondly, we can pray. We can pray for our children, for our grandchildren, for our spouses, for those we know and love who, as of yet, do not know the Lord. And then we can live in such a way that with our lives, we do not contradict the gospel we proclaim with our lips, but we show it. So that those who we know and love might say, I do not believe the things they believe, but at least I know they believe them. And let me give you three ways very practically we can leave some of that. First of all, in our lives, brothers and sisters, make repentance real. Do not just talk about the gospel, but live it. This came up in my home group this week, how particularly as young dads, we have to be humble with our children. Let them see you on your knees saying, I'm sorry, I've sinned against you. Daddy needs Jesus' grace as much as you. Secondly, love Jesus visibly, not just theoretically. Don't just talk about Jesus in the home. Show Jesus. Show him to be your joy, your treasure, your strength. And then lastly, order your family's life around the local church. The local church is the gift, the greatest gift this side of heaven that Jesus, in a sense, leaves to his people. So let your friends, let your family see this thing that you do is not just a Sunday hobby. It is your life. Let them see you serve and worship and sacrifice. Let us, in that sense, leave spiritual wealth. But we also must talk about financial wealth as well. Notice in the Egyptian culture that Jacob has lived for 17 years, the Egyptians hoarded their treasures even in death. They would fill their tombs with gold and jewelry and everything they thought they would need for the afterlife. But you and I know they could not take it with them. Those treasures that they hoarded were eventually plundered by thieves and robbers. And you and I know the earthly resources we have in this life, we cannot take beyond the grave. I have never been involved in a funeral where there's been a removal van behind the hearse. Naked we come, and naked we will go. And so, brothers and sisters, just as we can leave our loved ones spiritually better off, so we can also do the same regarding the purposes of God. That when our time comes to a close, how are we using the resources God has given us for the good of those we love beyond the grave. Every so often we see, don't we, adverts on the TV from charities or organizations talking about leaving a lasting legacy in your will. Animal trusts, medical charities, and other causes. And if such charities can think about long-term impact, then surely as Christians we must do the same. And let me tell you a story about a lady who did that beautifully. I knew a lady once who did not have much family. The church were very much her family, and when her time came to die, it was revealed to that church that she had left a large proportion of her estate to the church. That money then allowed that local church to begin to modernize some of its facilities, to launch new ministries, and through those ministries, people have now come to faith. But I also knew another lady, a similar background. She did not have much family, and she decided to leave all of her earthly assets to a cat sanctuary. And while there's absolutely nothing wrong with leaving money to charities, and hear me well there, and as much as we also need and have a responsibility to care for our earthly families, the question becomes for each of us, how are we using the resources that God has trusted to us, not only in this life, but even beyond the grave, so that they can be means in which the gospel is advanced, so that we leave a lasting legacy that points beyond ourselves to the great King in whom we serve. So here we see, number one, when life is fading, God is providing. Secondly, when days grow short, leave more than memories. And now lastly, when the end draws near, God's sovereignty remains. Throughout the book of Genesis, there are these scattered prophetic statements as early back as Genesis 3, verse 15, of the coming of the serpent crusher. And then here, as we turn to Genesis 49, we come to the last great section. It becomes this sense of a summary of what has happened and where the Bible is going to go going forward. For here we see Jacob gathers his sons together and he begins to talk. And he shares, not simply as a father giving an educated guess, knowing his sons' personalities, what will become of them and their descendants. But Jacob acts here as a prophet, declaring something of the future destiny of the tribes of Israel. And as you walk through Genesis 49, let me encourage you to read that another time, you begin to see this profound truth that God's promises will always come to pass. That just as we've seen in the story of Joseph, they can sometimes come through extraordinary and sometimes very ordinary things. Sometimes they come about through suffering, other times through betrayal or even uncertainty, and yet through them all, we see the sovereignty of God at work. In Genesis 49, Jacob's days are now coming to an end. He calls his sons together and he begins to bless them. In verse 3, he blesses Reuben. In verse 5, he blesses Simeon. And then in verse 8, he begins to bless Judah. And particularly in the life of Judah, we see the sovereignty of God shining through. Because think about one of the first times we were introduced to Judah in the story of Joseph was when he was making suggestions of sending him off as a slave. And then from that moment, the storyline of Joseph is interrupted by the story of Judah and Tamar. And yet, just as we were reminded this morning that God is able to use people who are far from squeaky clean, who somehow get caught up in his purposes and promises, that is so true in the story of Judah. Because notice what happens, Genesis 49, verse 10. Here's Jacob, the patriarch, as a prophet declaring truth that is coming to pass. Verse 10, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. Do you see, even in the messiness of Judah's life, God is going to work. His sovereignty will shine through because it is from the tribe of Judah that the Christ will come. Shows sure and certain of the purposes of God that even in the messiness of people's lives, God can work. And that does not excuse people's sin, but it means so powerful is God that he can take people's sin and somehow in his good purposes bring out good from it. Now, way back in Genesis 25, we hear about the birth of Jacob and Esau. And from that moment, from Genesis 25 through to here, there is 25 chapters. Roughly half the book is taken up in part with much about the life of Jacob. But then notice with me, when it comes time to for his death, see how quickly it's summed up. Genesis 49, verse 33. When Jacob had finished giving instruction to his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. And then we see, while much of Genesis 37 onwards is taken up with the story of Joseph, when his days come to an end. So little is written, Genesis 50, verse 28. So Joseph died at the age of 110. And after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. And naturally, you can look at that and you can think, how is that? How can it be that these two prominent men, whose lives have filled much of the first book of the Bible, why is it when it comes time for their death, they're just brushed over? That doesn't make sense. And the answer is because the star of the story of the book of Genesis has never been about Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or even the dreamer Joseph. The story and the star of the book of Genesis and the story of the Bible is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the same is true for us. It's never been about us, and it never should be about us. Remember those words about David, who served faithfully in his own generation and then was taken home to glory? That should be true for each of us. We serve in our generation, and then we're taken home to glory. One of my favorite sayings, I think just captures it so well, is this: preach the gospel, die, and be forgotten. Not that life is meaningless, but that the story is bigger than you and me. As we begin to draw things to a close, notice that in the life of Jacob, we see in these final chapters a picture and a model of what it looks like to prepare well to die. Here is a man who has gone through highs and lows, successes and failures, and yet at the end, here is a man anchored in the promises and the faithfulness of his God. And even in his death, he makes this declaration: Egypt has not been my home, and it never will be. So, Christian, I ask you tonight, how are you preparing for your death? Over the last 6 months as a church, we have walked through a season, haven't we, where we have been confronted with this reality. From October through to February, I have been involved in 9 different funerals. Many of them dear friends, brothers and sisters of this church, and 2 things have become very clear to me through this season. Number 1 is the fleeting nature of life. We are but a breath, and then we are gone, a flower of the field, and it is blown away. And none of us know when that day will be. So yes, 100%, we need to make sure we are right with our Maker. But also we should be thinking about our funeral wishes. Be thinking about leaving a lasting legacy spiritually and financially for our friends, our family, and our church. But the second thing that particularly struck me in a number of funerals where we've seen these beautiful photos appearing on the screen before and after the service. And it was this, that in preparing well for death, we must be ready to live. That in being confronted with our mortality, we are called to live faithfully and intentionally, but also fully. And so hear these words from Ecclesiastes chapter 8, and then we're going to sing. In Ecclesiastes, you've got different seasons of life. And then in chapter 8, we hear these words, and may this be true for us. So I commend the enjoyment of life, because there is nothing better for a person under the sun than to eat and drink and be glad. Then joy will accompany them in their toil all the days of the life God has given them under the sun. Friends, my prayer for us this week has been not only would we be a people who are prepared well to die, but that in our life we would know it to be a gift and that we would live it to the full, and you and I can live it to the full because Christ has come so we can live it to the full. So let's be about that in our lives.